The dawn of March 16, 1968, rose softly over the Vietnamese countryside. The village of My Lai in the Quang Ngai province of South Vietnam lay quiet beneath a pale mist. The rice paddies shimmered under the early light, reflecting the calm surface of a world at war. From above, everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. In the humid air, the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades broke the morning silence. It was a small U.S. Army OH-23 Raven observation helicopter, one of many circling the region that day. Inside were 3 men. At the controls sat Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr., 24 years old, from Stone Mountain, Georgia. He had been in Vietnam only a few months, long enough to understand the confusion of war, but not long enough to lose his sense of humanity. Behind him, in the cramped rear compartment, sat Crew Chief Glenn Andreotta and door gunner Lawrence Colburn. They were young, weary, and loyal, just doing what was asked of them, like so many others. Their mission that morning was simple on paper: to provide aerial reconnaissance and support for a ground operation being conducted by Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, 11th Brigade. It was part of a wider sweep called Operation Muscatine, aimed at rooting out suspected Viet Cong fighters from the area. Thompson's orders were to fly low, spot enemy movement, and radio back any signs of resistance. It was a routine mission, or so it seemed. From the air, Thompson and his crew could see American soldiers moving through the small hamlets of Sun Mai village. They spotted smoke rising, heard bursts of gunfire, and saw flashes of explosions. It looked like a typical combat operation, but something felt wrong. Thompson's eyes narrowed as he noticed what lay in the rice paddies below. Bodies, dozens of them. Women, children, old men, none with weapons, all motionless. He radioed, "Headquarters, this is Raven 3. We've got a lot of civilians down here. Looks like unarmed people. Please advise." There was no clear answer. Flying lower, Thompson could now see the horror in detail. He spotted wounded villagers lying in the open, some moving slightly, others completely still. A woman clutching a child, a boy trying to crawl, soldiers standing nearby, rifles at the ready. At first, Thompson thought it might have been the result of crossfire, perhaps a tragic mistake in the chaos of battle. But as the minutes passed, the picture became unmistakable. There was no fighting, no enemy fire, only systematic killing. He hovered over a ditch filled with bodies. Among them, small figures. Children, some barely old enough to walk. Others huddled together, hands over their faces. Thompson's voice was calm, but strained as he turned to Andreotta and Colburn. "Something's wrong down there." He banked the helicopter to make another pass, searching for signs of Viet Cong forces. There were none. Instead, he saw groups of villagers being herded together by U.S. troops. He could make out the company's markings. Charlie Company, commanded by Lieutenant William Calley. As Thompson circled once more, he saw soldiers firing into the groups. Villagers collapsed in heaps. He could see bodies falling into an irrigation ditch, the air filled with smoke, and the distant cries of people begging for mercy. The realization hit him with full force. They're killing them. They're killing civilians. For a brief moment, Thompson froze. Every instinct as a soldier told him to follow orders, to stay out of ground operations. But another voice, the one that had guided him since he'd taken an oath to protect life, told him to act. He keyed the radio again, this time with urgency. "Raven 3 to ground units. You need to cease fire immediately. You're killing civilians down the..." Still no response. Andreotta and Colburn looked at each other, disbelief on their faces. They were trained to spot the enemy, not to witness something like this. As they flew over the village again, Thompson saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A small boy standing in a field, clutching his mother's hand. Both were shot seconds later. The helicopter's cabin fell silent. Only the dull chop of rotor blades filled the air. Thompson turned his aircraft away from the village for a moment, flying low over the paddies, trying to collect his thoughts. He felt anger, confusion, shame. How could American soldiers, his own side, be doing this? He realized he couldn't simply watch. Thompson decided to land. Bringing the helicopter down near a small irrigation ditch, he stepped out, leaving his headset behind. The stench of death hit him immediately. Bodies lay scattered. Villagers, old and young, some still alive, moaning softly. He approached a wounded woman who was trying to move. He knelt beside her, motioning for Andriata to come help. There was nothing they could do without medical aid. He marked the spot on his map. Then Thompson saw soldiers nearby, advancing on another group of villagers. Unarmed farmers, women and children huddled by a shelter. He ran toward them, waving his arms. "Hold your fire! There are civilians here!" The soldiers hesitated, but didn't lower their weapons. Thompson glared at them. "Don't you shoot!" He climbed back into his helicopter and radioed command one final time. "If they open fire on those people, I'm going to have my guns on them. You copy that?" Silence again. The helicopter lifted, dust swirling beneath its skids. Thompson's crew exchanged looks. They knew what that meant. If American soldiers began shooting civilians again, they would have to intervene, by force if necessary. As the aircraft rose over My Lai, Thompson saw more smoke, more destruction. What had begun as a routine operation had turned into one of the darkest days in U.S. military history. And Hugh Thompson was now caught in the middle of it. But he had made a choice. He would not look away. The helicopter climbed slowly above the burning hamlet. Smoke drifted through the sky, carrying the faint echo of gunfire and screams. Beneath the rotor wash, the green rice fields of My Lai were stained dark with blood. From above, Thompson saw groups of American soldiers moving methodically through the village. There was no return fire, no signs of a battle, only bodies and smoldering huts. The silence between gunshots was worse than the sound itself. Thompson turned to his crew. "We're not leaving. We're going to find out what's happening." He maneuvered the small helicopter toward another cluster of huts, where villagers were running for cover. Below, U.S. troops were advancing, rifles raised, faces hard, their uniforms darkened with sweat and grime. The helicopter circled low, and Thompson saw something moving in an irrigation ditch, a small hand waving weakly. He descended for a closer look. As the skids touched down near the ditch, the three-man crew stepped out. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Thompson moved carefully toward the sound of crying. What he saw next stopped him in his tracks. The ditch was filled with bodies, men, women, and children, piled together. Some had been shot at close range. Others clung to each other in their final moments. A few still breathed, their eyes open, pleading silently for help. Andriata, standing beside him, whispered, "My God." Thompson felt his stomach tighten. He had flown over many battlefields before, but nothing like this. This wasn't war. It was slaughter. He reached for his radio. "Raven 3 to command. We've got a ditch full of civilians here. Do you understand? Civilians. I need a medevac down here now." The response came back cold, mechanical. "Roger that, Raven 3. We'll take it under advisement." It wasn't the urgency he needed. It sounded like someone trying to brush him off. Thompson clenched his jaw. He realized he might be the only one trying to stop what was happening. He climbed back into the cockpit and took off again, hovering low over the fields. Below, he saw more soldiers. The same company, Charlie Company, rounding up villagers near a bunker. About 10 of them, old men, women, small children clutching each other. Thompson's blood ran cold as he watched Lieutenant Callie and his men ordering the villagers into a trench. Soldiers stood ready with rifles. He grabbed the radio again, yelling into his mic. Stop firing! Stop it! You've got civilians down there! No response. Then, through the open door, Andriata shouted, "They're going to shoot them!" Thompson didn't hesitate. "We're landing! Now!" The helicopter dropped quickly, kicking up dust as it touched down between the soldiers and the terrified villagers. Thompson jumped out, waving his arms. "Hold your fire! These are unarmed civilians!" The American soldiers hesitated, surprised. A lieutenant, Callie, stepped forward, his expression tense. "We're under orders," he snapped. "These people are Viet Cong." Thompson glared at him. "They're villagers. They're unarmed. Look at them." The two men stared at each other, the tension thick in the air. Around them, the civilians huddled together, trembling. Finally, Thompson turned to his crew. "Andriata, Colburn, stay here. If they open fire, you shoot back. Over their heads if you have to, but you keep those people alive." The two young men exchanged a glance, their faces pale. They nodded. They were ready to protect unarmed villagers, even if it meant confronting their own countrymen. Thompson walked back toward the group of soldiers. "You're not killing these people, not while I'm here." He motioned to the villagers. "Get out of here, go, get to cover." The villagers didn't need another signal. They ran, some carrying children, disappearing into the trees. Thompson stood watching until they were gone, then turned back to his aircraft. The soldiers looked at him with disbelief, but none raised their rifles. For the moment, the killing had stopped. Back in the helicopter, Thompson took a deep breath. His voice trembled slightly as he keyed his mic. "Raven 3 to command. I've just evacuated civilians under fire from U.S. troops. We need to stop this operation before more die." Command gave no direct acknowledgement, only routine static. As he lifted off, Andriata leaned forward. "Sir, down there. The ditch. There's someone alive." Thompson turned the helicopter and set down again near the ditch. Andriata jumped out and ran to the pile of bodies. Moments later, he emerged carrying a small child, covered in blood but alive. They flew the child to a nearby hospital zone, leaving him with medics before returning immediately to the village. Thompson couldn't walk away yet. Over the next hour, they continued to circle the area, marking coordinates where survivors might still be found. Each time they flew over My Lai, the scale of the massacre became clearer. Dozens of huts burned, fields littered with bodies, livestock shot, entire families wiped out. What had been described as a search and destroy mission had become an annihilation. By the end of the day, more than 500 civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, would be dead. Thompson and his crew were among the few witnesses to see it unfold in real time, and the only ones who tried to stop it. As the helicopter finally turned back toward base, Thompson's hands gripped the controls tightly. He was silent for most of the flight. Andriata and Colburn didn't speak either. Each of them understood what had just happened, and what it meant. When they landed, Thompson walked straight into the operations tent. His uniform was covered in dust, his face pale with anger. He confronted his superior officers and spoke clearly, without hesitation. "Sir, something very wrong happened out there today. American soldiers were killing unarmed civilians. You need to shut this down." The officer looked up, startled. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, "You'd better write that in your report." Thompson did. Every detail. The bodies, the shootings, the faces of the villagers, the refusal of his radio calls. When he finished, he handed in his report and walked out of the tent, feeling both relief and dread. He had done what he could. But deep down, he feared the truth might never leave that room. When Hugh Thompson returned from My Lai that afternoon, the base was quiet. No one spoke about what had happened. No official debrief. No urgent radio orders. It was as if the massacre he had witnessed, and risked his life to stop, had simply not occurred. Thompson filed his report as instructed. It was brief, direct, and factual. It stated that American troops had fired on unarmed civilians and that he and his crew had intervened to protect survivors. But once the paperwork was handed in, nothing happened. No arrests, no investigations, no mention of My Lai. He were moved on, and so did the army. For the next year, Thompson continued flying missions across Vietnam. But he noticed that, among fellow soldiers, rumors about what had happened at My Lai were spreading, always vague, always distorted. Some claimed that a major battle had taken place, and hundreds of enemy combatants were killed. Others said that Thompson had interfered in an active operation. He could feel the growing unease. The more he spoke about what he had seen, the colder the reception became. Most didn't want to hear it. By early 1969, the official story of My Lai was recorded as a successful mission. Over 120 Viet Cong killed, no civilian casualties reported. The army had buried the truth beneath numbers and silence. But then, in late 1969, something unexpected happened. A young soldier named Ronald Ridenauer, who had heard whispers of the massacre from his comrades, began to investigate on his own. He wasn't at My Lai, but what he learned disturbed him deeply. Ridenauer began collecting letters, testimonies, and fragments of truth. And then, he did something extraordinary. He wrote to every senior official he could reach, including the president, demanding an investigation into what he described as a mass murder. His letters triggered a chain reaction. Journalists began asking questions. The army, under pressure, reopened internal reports, including Hugh Thompson's original testimony. For the first time, someone read his account and realized it contradicted the official narrative completely. Soon after, a quiet inquiry began. Investigators flew to Vietnam, spoke to villagers, and reviewed aerial photos. What they found matched Thompson's story exactly. The truth could no longer be contained. In November 1969, American journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story to the public. Headlines appeared across the United States. U.S. soldiers massacre hundreds of civilians at My Lai. The details were horrifying. Old men shot in the head, children executed, women assaulted before being killed, entire families wiped out. And in the middle of it all, the helicopter crew that had tried to stop it. For millions of Americans, My Lai became the turning point, the moment when faith in the Vietnam War began to collapse. Hugh Thompson was suddenly at the center of a storm. Reporters wanted interviews, the army wanted statements, politicians wanted answers. But instead of being praised for his courage, Thompson found himself isolated. Some fellow officers viewed him as a traitor, the man who had turned against his own. He began receiving hate mail, even death threats. One letter called him a disgrace to the uniform. At military gatherings, he was ignored or shunned. All he had done was tell the truth. The Army's official investigation, led by Lieutenant General William Pearce, confirmed what Thompson had said from the beginning. Between 347 and 504 civilians had been murdered at My Lai on March 16, 1968. No enemy combatants, no crossfire, only unarmed villagers. The Pearce report concluded that what happened at My Lai was a tragedy of major proportions, and that many officers had tried to cover it up. In 1970, the United States Army charged 14 men with crimes related to the massacre. Only one, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. Calley was found guilty of murdering 22 villagers. His sentence, life in prison. But even that justice would not last long. Under public pressure and political debate, Calley's sentence was reduced. After just 3.5 years under house arrest, he was released. For the villagers of My Lai, justice never truly arrived. For Hugh Thompson, the experience left deep scars. He had done what conscience demanded, but he was treated as if he had done something wrong. Years later, in interviews, he spoke quietly about that time. I'd been trained to protect the innocent, to fight armed enemies, not women and children. That day, something broke inside me. I just couldn't walk away. Despite the bitterness that followed, Thompson remained proud of his crew. Andriata, the door gunner who had rescued the child, was killed in combat just 3 weeks after the massacre. Larry Colburn, the crew chief, stayed close to Thompson for life. The two men bonded forever by what they had witnessed. In the years following the war, Thompson struggled to adjust to civilian life. He worked as a helicopter pilot, a mechanic, and later as a veterans counselor. He rarely spoke about My Lai. When he did, it was never with anger, only sorrow. It would take nearly 30 years for America to recognize what he had done that day. In 1998, on the 30th anniversary of the massacre, the United States Army finally awarded Hugh Thompson, Larry Colburn, and Glenn Andriata the Soldier's Medal, the highest military honor for bravery not involving combat. At the ceremony, Thompson spoke softly. "It's never easy to stand up against your own, but sometimes you have to, because if you don't, then what are we?" His voice trembled, but his conviction was steady. For decades, he had carried the weight of what he saw, and the burden of being the man who told the truth. Now, finally, the world acknowledged that courage. When the medals were finally pinned to their chests in 1998, it had been 30 years since that morning in My Lai. For most of those decades, Hugh Thompson had lived quietly, far from the spotlight. He had no desire to relive the war or the memories that haunted him. But even as the years passed, the echoes of My Lai never truly faded. In classrooms, military academies, and documentaries, the massacre became a defining lesson, a case study in morality, obedience, and the limits of human conscience. For Hugh Thompson, that lesson was deeply personal. He had seen what blind obedience could do. He had witnessed how ordinary soldiers, under orders, could become instruments of destruction. He had also seen how one small act of defiance, one refusal to go along, could save lives and restore humanity. Over time, historians began to re-examine his actions with greater appreciation. Books, interviews, and documentaries started to shift the narrative. The man who was once branded a traitor came to be recognized as one of the few true heroes of the Vietnam War. But recognition came at a cost. Thompson suffered from post-traumatic stress for years. The images of that day, the bodies in the ditches, the crying children, the chaos and disbelief, never left him. He often said that what haunted him most wasn't what he did, but what he saw others do. There were nights he'd wake up in silence, heart pounding, the sound of helicopter rotors echoing in his memory. In interviews later in life, he reflected on that moment when he landed his helicopter between armed soldiers and civilians. "I was scared to death," he said, "but there was no time to think. You just do what's right, or you don't." His words carried the simplicity of truth. While Thompson avoided the public eye, others made sure his story was not forgotten. Historians are agreed that his intervention at My Lai was one of the few moments of moral clarity in a war clouded by confusion and controversy. Ethicists and military instructors began teaching the Thompson example, the moment when a soldier put conscience above command. At West Point and other military academies, cadets studied his decision as part of their ethics curriculum. The lesson was simple but profound. Obedience is not absolute. Morality must guide orders. In 1998, Thompson and Colburn returned to Vietnam for the first time since the war. It was not an easy journey. The air was heavy with memories, and the fields they flew over decades earlier were now quiet farmlands again. At My Lai, they met survivors, women and men who had been children that day. Many wept, some recognized them. One elderly woman stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, and thanked them in Vietnamese. Thompson stood silently for a moment, unable to speak. He later recalled, All I could think was, I wish we'd been there sooner. They laid flowers at a memorial erected in honor of the victims. A tall stone monument carved with the names of hundreds of villagers. It was peaceful, surrounded by palm trees and the sound of wind moving through rice fields. For the first time, Thompson seemed to find some measure of peace. In the years that followed, he spoke occasionally at schools and veterans gatherings. He didn't speak as a hero, but as a witness, reminding younger generations what happens when conscience falls silent. You have to look in the mirror, he told one audience, and ask yourself, if I see something wrong, do I have the courage to stop it? His voice had grown softer with age, but the conviction never left. By the early 2000s, the story of My Lai had become a permanent part of American history. It stood not just as a symbol of tragedy, but also of moral reckoning. The moment a soldier's humanity overcame the madness of war. Hugh Thompson's health declined in his later years. Decades of service and stress had taken their toll. In January 2006, he passed away at the age of 62. Larry Colburn, his friend and fellow crewman, was by his side in his final days. At Thompson's funeral, Colburn spoke through tears. He taught us all that courage isn't about facing the enemy. It's about facing ourselves. A few years later, the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff formally recognized Thompson's actions as a model of moral integrity. At the My Lai site in Vietnam, the memorial now includes photographs of Thompson and his crew. Visitors from around the world come to read their story. One small plaque bears a simple inscription in both English and Vietnamese. They stood for humanity in a time of war. That line captures the essence of his legacy. Hugh Thompson didn't change the course of the Vietnam War. He didn't stop the violence that followed. But in one village, on one morning, he changed everything for the people still alive because of him. It's estimated that his intervention saved at least a dozen lives, perhaps more. But the greater number may never be known, because the true measure of his courage lies not in statistics, but in the example he left behind. Every generation that studies My Lai confronts the same question: what would I have done? Most of us hope we'd have the strength to do what he did, to step forward when everyone else steps back. The truth is, few people ever do. And that's what makes Hugh Thompson's story so enduring. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, one act of conscience can still pierce the shadows. In the decades since that March morning in 1968, the story of My Lai has become one of the most studied, debated, and haunting episodes in modern military history. But within that tragedy lies a smaller, brighter thread. The story of one man who chose to sow a humanity where others saw only the enemy. Hugh Thompson Jr.'s actions did not erase the horror of what happened at My Lai. The massacre remains one of the darkest moments of the Vietnam War. But what he did that day, landing his helicopter in the middle of chaos, standing between terrified villagers and armed soldiers, offered the world something rare. A glimpse of moral clarity in a time of madness. Over time, historians began to recognize that his defiance was not an act of rebellion, but an act of principle. Thompson had not disobeyed orders, he had obeyed the deeper code that underpins all moral law, the duty to protect life. In the aftermath of My Lai, the U.S. Army faced years of soul-searching. Military academies and leadership programs began using Thompson's story as a teaching case. His decision became a cornerstone of modern military ethics, illustrating that even in war, there are lines that must never be crossed. At the United States Military Academy at West Point, cadets studied the moment when he landed between soldiers and civilians. They debated the question that every soldier may one day face. When does obedience end and conscience begin? For the next generation, Hugh Thompson's name became synonymous with integrity. His example reminded soldiers that duty without humanity is hollow, and that courage is not measured by aggression, but by restraint. In documentaries and interviews, Veterans who had once resented him later expressed gratitude. They admitted that what he did had forced the country to confront truths it wanted to ignore. By stopping the killings, Thompson had not only saved lives, he had helped save the moral core of the American military. Years after his death, the U.S. Army established ethics awards in his honor. His story became required reading in officer training programs. In the halls of military academies, instructors speak his name alongside other figures who exemplified moral courage, people who chose what was right over what was easy. But beyond medals and honors, Hugh Thompson's legacy lives most powerfully in the question his story leaves behind. War, by its nature, strips away layers of humanity. It reduces complex lives to enemies and allies, numbers and targets. In the middle of that, it takes extraordinary strength to see the person, not the uniform, not the label, but the human being. That's what Thompson saw that morning in My Lai. When he looked down from his helicopter and saw civilians running for their lives, he didn't see the enemy. He saw people, mothers, children, the elderly, all trying to survive. And he acted not as a soldier bound by command, but as a human being bound by conscience. He once said in an interview, "If I hadn't done something, I'd have to live with that for the rest of my life. And I couldn't." Those few words capture the essence of moral courage. It isn't about being fearless. It's about acting even when fear, confusion, and danger make it hardest to think clearly. In later years, survivors from My Lai continued to honor him. Many regarded him as a savior. To them, he wasn't a foreign soldier. He was the man who came from the sky to stop the killing. Their children and grandchildren still visit the memorial today. Among the names of the lost, they place flowers beneath a small plaque bearing his photograph. A young pilot in a green flight suit, looking calm, serious, and impossibly young. Visitors often pause before that picture. Some bow, some whisper a quiet thank you. Back in America, those who knew him remember a quiet, humble man who rarely spoke a word about himself. He never saw what he did as heroic. "It was just the right thing," he said. His humility made his courage even more profound. When Hugh Thompson died in 2006, his funeral was attended by veterans, military leaders, and ordinary citizens. Among the mourners were Vietnamese survivors who had traveled halfway around the world to pay their respects. During the service, a U.S. Army honor guard folded the flag over his casket. As it was presented to his family, the officer saluted and said, "On behalf of a grateful nation." It was a phrase often heard at military funerals, but in this case, it carried a deeper weight. The nation truly was grateful, though it had taken far too long to show it. Today, when historians speak of My Lai, they speak of two stories, the story of horror and the story of courage. They are inseparable, bound together as a reminder of both the darkness and the light that exist within human nature. In museums and memorials, photographs from that day are displayed with captions explaining the events. Among them is one simple black and white image. A helicopter hovering low over a rice field. A small group of villagers gathered beneath it. That moment, when Hugh Thompson and his crew landed to stop the massacre, has become an enduring symbol of conscience in warfare. Half a century later, his message still resonates. He showed that morality does not vanish in the chaos of war. It can survive, even in the mud and blood of the battlefield, if just one person has the courage to hold on to it. In the end, Hugh Thompson's greatest act was not of defiance, but of humanity. He saw people when others saw enemies. He chose compassion when others chose violence. And in doing so, he reminded the world that even in its darkest moments, the light of conscience can still break through.